just
And
mentioned,
then anytime you see me put a matrix next to an arrow like this one, it's meant to represent that multiplying this matrix by the vector at the arrow's start gives you the vector at the arrow's end.
Type to be module.
In this case, you multiply this matrix by all of the embeddings in the context, producing one query vector for each token.
Express.
The entries of this matrix are parameters of the model, which means the true behavior is learned from data, and in practice, what this matrix does in a particular attention head is challenging to parse. But for our sake, imagining an example that we might hope that it would learn, we'll suppose that this query matrix maps the embeddings of nouns to certain directions in this smaller query space that somehow encodes the notion of looking for adjectives in preceding positions. As to what it does to other embeddings, who knows? Maybe it simultaneously tries to accomplish some other goal with those. Right now, we're laser focused on the nouns.
Okay, so that's the very first thing that I wanted to mention.
Is a second matrix called the key matrix, which you also multiply by every one of the embeddings. This produces a second sequence of vectors that we call the keys.
Let's put the key called
Conceptually, you want to think of the keys as potentially answering the queries.
Run this when
the key matrix is also full of tunable parameters, and just like the query matrix, it maps the embedding vectors to that same smaller dimensional space. You think of the keys as matching the queries whenever they closely align with each other. In our example, you would imagine that the key matrix maps the adjectives, like fluffy and blue,
we are going really slowly,
that are
but I just want to make sure that we understand everything as we go. Now you can create more scripts if you really wanted to. So you can say something like hello.
Between
the
each
key doesn't
possible
really matter.
Query pair.
What matters is
I like
what
to
you will
visualize
run
a grid
on the
full of a
right-hand
bunch of
side.
dots,
But we don't really
where the
want to
bigger
have
dots
something
correspond
like
to the
hello.
larger dot
Instead, we'll
products,
have
the places
something
where the
called
keys and
start.
queries
This
align.
is something that we'll get
For
into
our
in a second.
adjective noun example, that would look a little more like this, where if the keys produced by fluffy and blue
so here
really
on the
do
back
align
end
closely
under
with the
the
query produced by
server.js,
Creature,
we are going to
then
build
the
an
dot
API.
products in
I'll
these two
explain what
spots
that means,
would be some
but first,
large
let's just
positive
build
numbers.
a really simple route,
In the
and
lingo,
then we'll
machine learning
understand
people would
what
say that this
does.
means the embeddings
So
of
here
fluffy
I'd
and
like to
blue
say something
attend
like
to the embedding of Creature.
.get method.
By contrast
so
to the dot product between the key for some other word like the and the query for Creature would be some small or negative value that reflects that these are unrelated to each other.
Run a function.
So we have this grid of values that can be any real number from negative infinity to infinity,
so these are the
giving us a
things
score
that
for how
Express will
relevant
pass
each word
by default.
is to updating the
You can
meaning
take
of
those
every other
values
word.
and maybe
The way
send
we're
a
about
response.
to use these scores
say
is to take a certain weighted sum along each column,
we can say something
weighted
like,
by the relevance.
You got
So instead of having values range from negative infinity to infinity, what we want is for the numbers in these columns to be between 0 and 1,
because we
and
have
for each column to add up to 1, as if they were a probability distribution.
So I'll go ahead and
if you're coming in from the last chapter, you know what we need to do then. We compute a softmax along each one of these columns to normalize the values.
Which is 5001. Let's say 5001.
In our picture, after you apply softmax to all of the columns, we'll fill in the grid with these normalized
we need to
values.
type this out because this
is what
we're
safe to think about each column as giving weights according to how relevant the word on the left is to the corresponding value at the top. We call this grid an attention pattern.
But we have just built our
now, if you look at the original Transformer paper, there's a really compact way that they write this all down.
And we are handling it properly.
Here, the variables Q
now, obviously,
and K
this is not what we'd like to do. This is just for
of
testing
query and key
purposes.
vectors,
But
respectively.
let's see what is an API in the
by
first
multiplying
place.
the embeddings
And just
by the
before we
query
get
and the
into
key
the
matrices.
APIs, let's
This
see
expression
how
up in the
a full-stack
numerator
app
is a
works
really
in the first
compact
place.
way to represent
So you
the
would
grid
have
of
your
all
client,
possible dot
which is the
products
front end,
between
and we
pairs
have
of keys
a
and
server,
queries.
right, which is our backend.
A small
And then
technical
we have a
detail that I didn't
database
mention
where we
is that for
store the
numerical
data.
stability,
So
it
from the
happens to be
client,
helpful
user
to
would
divide all
send
of these
a
values
request.
by the square
Here,
root
let's
of the
say they
dimension
want to
in
delete
that
a
key
post,
query
right?
space.
They click to this button.
Then this
they would
softmax
send a
that's wrapped
request
around the
to
full
the
expression
server.
is meant
So
to
we
be
got the
understood
request.
to apply
Now we'd
column
like
by
to
column.
delete it from the database.
As to that
the
V term,
backend will
we'll talk
delete
about it in
and
just a
send
second.
a response
Before
back,
that, there's
like
one other technical
success.
detail that
Here you
so
go,
far I have
this post
skipped.
has been deleted,
During the training
and the
process,
UI will
when
be
you run this
updated.
model on a
So
given
this is
text
what we call
example,
the
and
request
all of the
and
weights are
response
slightly adjusted and
lifecycle,
tuned to
right?
either
You
reward
send a
or punish
request
it based
and
on
get a
how high a
response back
probability it
that
assigns
would
to the
either
true next word in
successfully
the passage.
done or it would
turns
fail.
out to make the whole
So this
training
is how
process a
a
lot more
full-stack
efficient
application
if you
works
simultaneously
simply,
have it predict
but now
every
on the
possible
server,
next
there are one more thing
token
that we
following
need to
each
talk about,
initial
which is the
subsequence of
API.
tokens in this
So,
passage.
what's up with
For example,
API?
with the phrase that we've been
stands
focusing
for
on, it
Application
might also be
Programming
predicting what
Interface,
words
which
follow
is
creature and what
absolutely
words follow
doesn't make any
the.
sense. But in simple
this
terms,
is really nice because it means what would otherwise be a single training example effectively acts as many.
So we can think of it
for the
like
purposes
a
of our attention pattern.
This is a pretty classic
you
analogy
never want to
that
allow
we'll go
later
through,
words
but I
to
think this
influence
explains
earlier
everything,
words, since otherwise
like
they could kind of give away the answer for what comes next.
Okay,
what
so
this
we
means
have
is that we want all of these spots here, the ones
Let's say you
representing later
visit a
tokens
restaurant
influencing
where
earlier
you would like
ones,
to send a
somehow be
request,
forced
right?
to be
You're
zero.
the customer, you send a
The
request.
simplest thing you might think to
Let's say
do
you
is
want to
to
get
set them
a
equal to
chicken.
0, but if you did that,
Once
the
it is
columns
ready,
wouldn't add
you
up
will
to
get
1
it
anymore.
as a
They wouldn't be
response back,
normalized.
right?
So
I
instead,
just
a common
changed
way
the color,
to do this
you
is that
send a
before
request and
applying
get a response
softmax,
back.
you set all of those
And we
entries
have
to be
this
negative
man in the
infinity.
middle, which is the
If you do
API.
that, then
So that
after
was the
applying
analogy,
softmax,
and
all
in
of those
real
get
world,
turned into
you
0,
would send
but
a
the columns
request
stay
from your
normalized.
browser, right?
This
You would
process
send
is
a
called
request
masking.
and get a
There are
response
versions of
back.
attention where
Either, sir, it is us.
another fact that's worth reflecting on about this attention pattern is how its size is equal to the square of the context size.
Now in real world,
so
and
this is why
what we'll be
context
doing
size
in a
can be
couple
a
of
really
minutes,
huge bottleneck
you
for
would
large
actually
language
send
models,
a request,
and scaling it up is
let's say
non-trivial.
here delete
aimed at
a
making
post
context more
or delete
scalable.
a node,
But right here, you
and
and I are
maybe
staying
you would
focused on
have
the
another
basics.
endpoint
Okay,
where you
great.
would like to
Computing this
create a
pattern
node,
lets the
right?
model deduce
These are the
which
things
words
that
are
we'll be
relevant to
doing.
which other words.
But I
Now,
hope
you
for
need
now
to actually
everything makes
update the
sense.
embeddings,
This is what we
allowing
have
words
built
to
in
pass
simple
information to
terms.
whichever other
Now the
words
question
they're
is,
relevant to.
can't we just
For example,
get rid of
you
this
want the embedding
API,
of Fluffy
the man in the
to somehow
middle?
cause
Can't we
a
just
change to
interact
creature
with our
that moves it to a different part of this
from
12,000
the, let's say,
dimensional
from
embedding
the front
space
end?
that
Why do
more
we need it in
specifically
the first
encodes
place?
a Fluffy creature?
Why do we need an API?
What I'm going to do
so
here
the
is
answer
first
is
show
we
you the most
definitely need an
straightforward way that you
no
can do
matter
this,
what.
though
So
there's
you
a slight
cannot
way that
really
this gets
just
modified in the
access to
context
the
of multi-headed attention.
database. We
This
cannot
most
just
straightforward
interact
way
with the
would be to
database
use a third
from
have no effect.
basically
And
take
it
these
doesn't just have to be
controllers and
basketball.
put it under
The model
the
could also bake
specific
into
file.
this column many other
So everything
features
should be
that it
working
wants
as
to
exactly
associate with
as it was
something that has
before.
the full name
Now
Michael
the beauty
Jordan.
of this code base is that
And
later,
at the same
at some
time,
point,
all of
let's
the
say
other
you want to
columns
add
in
some
this
stuff
matrix
related
are telling
to
you what
products,
will be added.
where we'd like to read it from the environment variables. We'll say Redis, .com environment, and then the limiter. Now, what do you want to happen, right? In my case, I'll just put a comment. I'll say I want to create a rate limiter, let's type this out, that allows 10 requests
the black clouds are going off.
Package. So import the package and then call the config method. So we have created an instance and we are exporting it. Now it is time to use it. So again, let's use some best practices where we'd like to create the middleware folder. This is the folder that we can add our custom middlewares, right? So the one that I'd like to create will be rate-limiter.js file. So here in this file, we will create a function. Let's say const rate limiter, and I'd like to capitalize this one. Let's say it'll be an async function where we'll get the request.
Start, finish, straight, and then it's
Let's
almost
say
now a
request,
tailwind
get
for
the
the cars
response
completing
as
a
well
lap,
as the
and therefore
next,
down the
because
Doppler as
since
well,
this is
which
a
will help
middleware,
them,
we will
of course,
do
if you
some
get in the
checks,
tow of
right?
another car,
Once it is done,
and a bit of
we'll
wind
call the
behind.
next function.
Actually, no, that
Just like what we have done in the
headwind,
past.
don't you? So that the
So let's
tow
try to say,
is then
just export it
magnified,
first.
so it doesn't really help you a great deal. The other thing I love about this event is the mixed
Okay,
tyre
so let's say this will
manufacturer.